Welcome to Divine Couples. Your host, NAOMI Slater, will awaken your passion, deepen your intimacy, and invite healing into your relationships, working towards accessing higher levels of consciousness in all areas of your life. Come with us on this journey to explore and experience your fullest potential.
You are listening to Society Bites Radio, social interaction for the mind and soul. Thanks for joining us. I am your host, NAOMI Slater, and you have tuned into Divine Couples, adding intimacy, passion, and healing to your lives. So we're going to talk about Tantra today. What is Tantra? I know that this word is becoming way more common, and there still isn't really much of an understanding as to what Tantra is. So we're going to dive into that today. But first, I want to begin with my own personal story about Tantra. And I was a yoga teacher. I received my certification in 2005. I was traveling India. I was spending quite a bit of time in ashrams and studying with Indian gurus, and really diving very deep into my own spiritual practice, my yoga, asana practice, my meditation practice, and having all sorts of very deep spiritual awakenings. And this was really the beginning of my path. And fast forward a bit, I met my husband, and he was also on his own spiritual path. He was a massage therapist and a healer. And, you know, we started having children. And after our second child, we both felt like something was lacking a bit. Our lovemaking wasn't as exciting as it used to be. And I know that there are a lot of other couples that are in sometimes even short-term relationships, but definitely long-term relationships that feel that at a certain point, the lovemaking is just not what it was. It becomes more routine, it's not as passionate, and people end up feeling kind of dissatisfied with their lovemaking, which is a very important part of keeping a relationship happy and healthy. So we had this awareness that that we wanted to improve, and also our communication was deteriorating a bit. We were fighting a bit more, and kind of the stress of life and raising kids was making things a bit more difficult for us. And my husband was actually the first one introduced to Tantra. And he started practicing on his own. He started exploring his own sexuality, his own sexual nature, not with other partners, but just with himself, which is a very important part of Tantra, is learning our own selves sexually, exploring our own selves sexually. So he started doing that. And I was resisting. In the beginning, I didn't really want to have to, to really dive deep and do this work. It requires energy, and I was feeling like I was lacking in energy. Where am I gonna bring up this energy to invest in changing our relationship, in improving our sexual relations when I'm working, I'm raising kids, I'm cooking, I'm cleaning, I'm doing all of these things. But I realized that this isn't going to go away. He's super into this, and I either need to step it up, or something might fall apart. So I decided to step it up and started to explore Tantra on my own and explore my own sexuality. And I have to say that it really transformed me on a very deep level, and transformed our relationship, of course. Once you go through a deep transformation, that's going to affect every aspect of your life. So including your relationship, including your relationship with your kids, the energy at home. So really things changed on a very fundamental level for us, even though We had a good relationship. It wasn't like the sex was bad. It was good. But we both wanted more. We wanted to feel this kind of passion, this awakening, because we're both healers. We're on this spiritual path. We're not the types to compromise. So so ever since then, that was about 5 years ago. Ever since then, we have been practicing Tantra and now teaching Tantra. That is kind of our path in a nutshell. But I now want to explain to you what Tantra is on a much deeper level so that you really start to understand what it is we're talking about. So the meaning of the word Tantra, what does it mean? So tan in Sanskrit means wisdom, and tra in Sanskrit means saves. So essentially the meaning is wisdom that saves. So on the one hand, it strengthens and protects us. And on the other hand, it also bestows upon us this ultimate spiritual liberation, which of course is central to any spiritual path, and Tantra is a spiritual path. In addition, tan also means to stretch or expand. So this essentially means that it's a way to stretch or expand our awareness and our consciousness, our wisdom. So these are really the meanings of the word Tantra. Tantra says that the range of mental experience can be broadened. So we can have an experience that's based on an object, something very kind of materialistic. And we can also have an experience when the present mind expands beyond its given definitions and borders into something that's much larger than us. We kind of receive this different perspective that when we were having experiences that were more based on objects, we weren't expanding into. So Tantra says we can have these larger experiences. These are commonly referred to as nirvana, moksha, these are Sanskrit words, emancipation, self-realization, liberation, kundalini awakening. So these are all different terms for this experience, which goes beyond objects. It's an expanding of our consciousness. So many think that once you experience this, whether it be self-realization, kundalini awakening, liberation, whatever you want to call it, many think that once you have this experience, your work is done. This is, of course, not true. Nothing is ever done. What happens is the level of experience that you were experiencing before the awakening ends, and a new level of experience comes forth. Now, let's talk a bit about some of the core tantric principles. So Tantra sees everything as an expression of divinity. So the good, the bad, the ugly, and the beautiful, they're all an expression of divinity. There's one universal consciousness, and all of these expressions are a part of that universal consciousness. Another aspect of Tantra is that ultimate knowledge is revealed through the study and understanding of the human experience. This is actually something that I really, really love about Tantra is you're not held to any dogma or any, prophet or one book that essentially has all of the rules and regulations for spiritual enlightenment, but rather your study, deep study of the human experience is how knowledge is revealed to you. Now, this also has its dangers, but we're not really going to dive into that so much. Tantra reveals a way of life and practices that will lead you to experiencing these higher truths. So the umbrella is living your life by these practices, and those practices will create these experiences that will then expand your consciousness. So gurus of Tantra have received their knowledge through direct experience, not through reading a book. And the texts, there are texts, the Tantras and the Agamas, were essentially written by various saints and masters that were all practicing these practices, experiencing this awakening or expansion of the consciousness, and then passing on that knowledge. So it's not, like I said, it's not one person who essentially wrote these texts. It's many masters that were writing and adding to these texts as they were experiencing these practices. Tantra is also the path of true love. It's the path of falling in love with life, no matter what the experience is. It's also the path of staying present and opening your heart. So really, Tantra is learning to accept everything in life and rejecting no part of the human experience. So Tantra is really this beautiful philosophy that really sees everything as being divine. Now, where does it come from? Where does Tantra come from? And I'm also going to talk a bit about yoga, because yoga is something that people are much more familiar with, and it will help me explain a bit more about Tantra. So yoga and Tantra developed simultaneously. They both developed around the 5th and 6th century, around the time of the Buddha. And they developed in different places. So there's Hindu Tantra, which of course developed in India, and Buddhist Tantra, which developed in Tibet. Now, they were both developing at around the same time and were influencing each other. Let me just talk briefly about yoga. So yoga is a set of psychophysical practices which people are more familiar with, which emphasizes meditation and different postures, or asanas is the term in Sanskrit, which are intended to discipline and integrate the body, mind, and spirit. Essentially, the ultimate aim is one of attaining a high spiritual goal. So as Tantra was also developing, it actually incorporated yoga as an important part of its system of practice. And eventually Tantra also expanded upon the existing body of yoga practice, adding many more techniques, complex pranayama or breath work, visualization exercises, mantras, more yoga postures, and of course, activation of the energy centers, or chakras, if you're familiar with the term, in the body. So modern yoga, or hatha yoga, actually has its roots in Tantra. However, the texts are different. So as I mentioned a bit earlier, the Tantra texts are the Tantras and the Agamas. The yogic texts are the Vedas and the Upanishads. Now, there are many overlapping practices and philosophies in both of these texts. However, they are fundamentally different. Now, both of these texts discuss the dynamic potential force in the material body, which is called Kundalini energy. And this is really seen to be one of the greatest discoveries of Tantra and Yoga, is how to access this energy and how to move this energy in order to create a spiritual awakening. So Kundalini is actually a small gland at the base of the spine. And through these different practices that are done both in Kundalini Yoga and in Tantra, this energy can be moved up the spine and into the brain, creating a spiritual awakening. So that's kind of a summary so that you kind of understand a bit about the background of Tantra. So now I'd like to talk about how Tantra is connected to sexuality. So modern day Tantra is seen to be focused predominantly on sexuality, but it's important to understand that Tantra is not only about sexuality. Actually, the ultimate goal of Tantra is, as I mentioned before, spiritual liberation and awakening. And sacred sexuality is used as a means to achieve that, to essentially awaken the Kundalini